Hello, everyone, and welcome to the next session of CME Palooza Fall 2020. I am Scott Kober, one of the co-producers of CME Palooza, and I would like to welcome you to our next session, which is entitled the CME Dictionary. And this session is sponsored by Clinical Care Options and Practicing Clinicians Exchange. Our moderator for this session is Aisha Suhail. Aisha is the president of Answers in CME. Now, for those of you who are wondering what a dictionary is, maybe some of you are in your 20s have never seen a dictionary. It looks something like this. It's a big book, lots of pages, and you actually use it to kind of look up words and to look up what the definition of words are. So probably, these days you look at the Google, but back in the day, we used to look a lot of the actual physical dictionary. So before I start the session, as with all of our CME Palooza sessions, I would like to recognize our sponsors, our gold sponsors, Daiichi Sankyo, Physicians Education Resource, Academic CME, our silver sponsors, Peer Audience, Medscape Education, Clinical Care Options, Practicing Clinicians Exchange, Haymarket Medical Education, Helio CME, Projects in Knowledge, Platform Q Health Education, and our bronze sponsors, PVI, Catalyst Medical Education, CMEology, the Academy for Continued Healthcare Learning, Vindigo Medical Education, Paradigm Medical Communications, the Postgraduate Institute for Medicine, Global Education Group, CE Outcomes, Integrity Continuing Education, Answers in CME, RMEI, Access Medical Education, MedIQ, Integritas Communications, Infograph Ed, Free CME, Med Learning Group, Primary Care Network, Prova Education, Red Med Ed, Peer Voice, and CME Outfitters. There will be a quiz at the end of the day to name as many of these as you can. Okay, there are two ways to ask questions during this and all CME Palooza sessions. If you are watching this live, you can use the free CME text line to send in a question. The number is 267-6660-CME0263. Or you can tweet your question to us using the CME Palooza hashtag. We've been getting great questions all day for most of our sessions. So any questions you ask, we will get to as many as we can. We will be incorporating audience response technology during this presentation via Poll Everywhere. If you have not already downloaded the app to your phone or mobile device, you can download it now and join the presentation entitled CME Palooza 000, or you can type in the following URL in a web browser, www.pollev.com/CME Palooza 000. One last thing, our speaker disclosure. Please note that the opinions, discussions, and or conclusions expressed are those of our panelists and do not represent an endorsement by or position of their employer, its parent company, or its affiliates. And with that, I am going to turn things over to Aisha to get us started.
Thanks so much, Scott. And of course, thank you for inviting us to be a part of this session and also to be a part of CME Palooza. I think it's pretty amazing to see what you and Derek have brought together as a community. And I will say, keep the emails coming because the FAQ email this week definitely made me laugh. So let's definitely keep those coming. So let's get the session started, but I'd like to start by introducing our panel. Our members come from different corners of the industry, and I think that it brought together a pretty fruitful discussion or plan for this session. So to start, we have Dara Croce, who's the Senior Manager of Grants Management and Strategic Giving at Biogen. Dara is managing the U.S. portfolio of independent educational grants for all of Biogen's therapeutic areas for the past 2 years. So welcome, Dara.
Thank you.
And then moving on to Pesha Rubinstein, who is the Director of Continuing and Professional Education at the American Medical Informatics Association, AMIA. And Pesha has been with the organization for 7 years. Welcome, Pesha. And then, of course, we have Kristen Hassan, who many of us know, who is the Director of Continuing Education at the National Comprehensive Cancer Network, which most of us know as the NCCN. And Kristen has been with the NCCN for 17 years. So welcome, team.
Thank you. Hi.
As I mentioned, in preparation for this session, we brainstormed on what terms we should discuss, and we thought it would be best to identify terms that we might see on a regular basis, some terms that have recently emerged, and then some terms that are actually open to interpretation. And as we were discussing them during our meetings, a few of us actually had different views of the same term or different applications of the same term as well. So without further ado, we'll get started. And we would also love to have feedback from the audience. You can text, as Scott mentioned. And then there are also some poll questions that we've included throughout the presentation. But we'd love to get your perspective if your utilization of some of these terms or your interpretations of some of these terms differ from what we discussed. So let's get started with Pesha, who we're going to start with something that might sound basic, but has some more context to it. So starting with commercial interest. Over to you, Pesha.
Thank you, Aisha. We're starting with commercial interest because we found that it's kind of a moving target. So, Scott, I'm glad that you held up that dictionary to begin with, because we'll start with the classic, correct definition of what a commercial interest is according to the ACCME. So, a commercial interest is any entity producing, marketing, reselling, or distributing healthcare goods or services consumed by or used on patients. Sounds pretty straightforward, and it's kind of a definition that I think is tattooed in the brain of every continuing education professional out there. But the ACCME doesn't really help us very much by then following that very clear definition with a whole list of exceptions that kind of sound like, well, this might actually have an impact on a patient that could be positive or negative, and could even lead to bias in a presentation. So some of the exceptions are publishing companies and health insurance providers and for-profit hospitals and practitioners. So things have gotten a little bit muddier over the years, especially with technology. So are these entities considered commercial interests or not? Well, not yet, according to the correct definition. And many of us might have participated in proposed changes to what are now called the Standards of Commercial Support that the ACCME sent out a number of months ago. And ACCME did distribute what those comments were, and there were all kinds of things in there. There are platforms, there are gigantic companies like Google and Apple. Are they not considered commercial interests now, even though they're producing technology that has an impact on patient care? Kristen, what do you think about this definition of commercial interest?
Well, I think that it's probably going to change in the near future. And at our organization, we actually use an expanded definition of commercial interest that would then include healthcare technology and services companies. And then you have to think about other companies that utilize big data and electronic health records and things like that. So, we always kind of expand the definition of commercial interest to really include industry. We think of it as industry. So anything that kind of goes under that umbrella.
I think that that's pretty much the way the whole enterprise is going to have to end up going. In our organization, we have people make disclosure, and we do engage in a resolution process. But instinctively, our presenters know that the commercial interest has really gone beyond the drug and medical device company. So I think that the accrediting organizations, they are paying attention. Kind of slicing and dicing, though, the way the proposed changes were from the ACCME. They're a little bit baffling because EHR companies are not considered commercial interests, but app companies are, even though apps might be engaged somehow, connected with the EHR companies. I know what the ACCME will say. They'll, of course, talk about who's the parent company. But stay tuned. So for now, there is a definite definition, but it's going to change. And that means your CME dictionary will have to have its definition change as well. I think we're ready for the next topic.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Pesha. The next one, actually, I feel like it's the perfect segue into what we just followed through. And for those tuning in, we did kind of start with the first aspects of a program, going into sort of the content per se, and then ending off with the assessments. So the next one that we had on our list is disclosure. And Pesha, I'm going to ask you to comment on this one, because one of the things that we all said was that this seems to be somewhat of a knee-jerk reaction for a lot of the faculty, or it's more like they're on autopilot when they provide their disclosure statement. So over to you, Pesha, for some elaboration.
Thank you. And yes, it is a natural segue to go from the commercial interest to disclosure, because we are required, of course, to not just collect disclosures from our presenters and planners. We also have to engage in a resolution process. This is nothing new, but it's like our presenters sometimes take a truth serum and they tell us everything. They tell us that they're disclosing that they've gotten grants from the NIH. They're disclosing that they've gotten some kind of grant from a not-for-profit organization, or they're consulting with the Kidney Foundation. So it ends up being like over disclosure. So how about, Scott, if you can present a poll? I'm going to read what the question is, and I'd really like the audience to respond with a yes, no, or I'm not sure. So in this scenario, a faculty presenter discloses that she has received a research grant from the NIH. So is this an example of an ACCME requirement for what needs to be disclosed? Thank you, audience. You are right. The answer is no, because you're supposed to be disclosing your relevant financial relationships with commercial interests. Let's move on to question 2. A faculty presenter discloses that he owns stock in electronic health record producer, and the topic is on quality improvement using EHR data. Is this an ACCME requirement for what needs to be disclosed? Yes, no, or I'm not sure.
Give it a couple seconds, Pesha. Give people a little bit more time to respond.
I am. You know what? We have such a savvy audience. I kind of, I was leading the witness with the last question. So that is interesting. And Kristen, would you like to comment on this response that we've gotten from the audience?
Well, it's interesting. Would it be an ACCME requirement? I'm not sure. It would be an NCCN requirement for sure. So where we have our expanded definition of commercial interest, we expect that our faculty will disclose all of those relationships. Transparency is really key for everything that we do as an organization, not just with CE. And we always err on the side of over disclosure. Just for both our staff, our committee members, and again, our CE faculty.
I agree that over disclosure is not a bad thing. I think that the definitions of commercial interest and the rules for disclosure are definitely in flux. And now there seems to be a movement, I think beginning with the scientific journals, that people disclose just about everything that may end up potentially biasing a presentation. So currently, if you're disclosing relevant financial relationships with commercial interests, it's supposed to include the actual planner or speaker and the spouse or life partner. What about your parents? What if your parents own stock in some big drug company and you've got this opportunity to somehow influence content? Children that are adult or not, they can actually also have these relevant financial relationships, and it may end up having an impact. If somebody is a speaker for the March of Dimes, maybe they would want to be able to insert something about that organization that may end up somehow biasing the material. And I'm just using these companies and these organizations as for instances. I know nothing about them. It's just to give a little bit more color to the talk. So I think that it's not a bad idea to have this kind of over disclosure because of the environment that we work in. I think that it's fair also to the learner to know just about all of these kinds of relationships. I do think that there would then be a challenge in whatever you want to call it, resolving for potential COI or mitigating. Kristen, would you want to comment at all on how you would resolve or mitigate for COI that's not required disclosure, that goes into this kind of over disclosure category that we're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, the resolution process is obviously not as robust as it would need to be for anything that would be considered a relevant disclosure. But I think that we just kind of have a standard organizational statement that we include with anything that, while not relevant, could be perceived by the learner as relevant.
So for your activities, do you have some kind of comment in the front matter that says something like, we're providing all of this disclosure in our effort to be transparent?
Yeah, we have a whole statement, our medical education policy statement, definitions of what a commercial interest is, what a relevant relationship is, and we include everything like everybody else does, within the past year.
Thanks. So I think for the CPD professionals out there, just like with commercial interest being a moving target, it looks like disclosure and mitigation or resolution is going to be something that we're going to be changing in our CME Dictionary in the future. So Aisha, back to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Pesha. The next one is actually also very interesting because it's something that has evolved and changed in the year that 2020 has been with the COVID-19 pandemic. Kristen, Pesha, this one is for you too as well. Don't worry, Dara, I'm going to be coming to you soon as well. RSS. So Kristen, do you want to start, or Pesha? Either one.
I think I'll start. I'll try to be really brief because Kristen actually has a very good challenge, I guess, to what the RSS is. So I started my career working for medical education companies that were for profit. And I don't really pay much attention to the RSS because it didn't seem relevant to us. So using our CME Dictionary, the ACCME definition is that a regularly scheduled series is a live activity planned as a series with multiple ongoing sessions, for example, offered weekly, monthly, or quarterly. An RSS is primarily planned and presented to the accredited organization's professional staff and generally targets the same audience over the whole series. Examples include grand rounds, tumor boards, and morbidity and mortality conferences. So again, it's a very clear definition and designed really for, more like the hospital setting. But what makes the RSS, it used to be a challenge for the hospitals to report the RSS to the annual ACCME reporting requirements, because each one of those meetings was considered a separate CME activity. And then the hospitals were able to include the entire RSS, the same repeated meetings, under one reporting line in the now PARS and what used to be just I think it was just a spreadsheet in the past. So why is this a problem? Why is the definition not clear? And I'm going to hand this over right back now to Kristen.
Well, I think the definition is clear, but what you just read could allow for a little interpretation. They used the word primarily. So it's primarily planned by and presented to an accredited organization's professional staff and generally targets the same audience. So I think that you could try to make an argument that maybe a series, so we've partnered with some other education companies to provide Grand Rounds programs throughout the country. So it's the same target audience, but it's not physically the same audience every time. And it is the same content, not like a series would be at a hospital. And I think maybe that ACCME has had this question posed to them because what they've also included under the definition you just provided is this statement. Live activities where the same content is offered multiple times for different audiences should be reported as separate courses and not regularly scheduled series. So I find that a little unfortunate. It seems like every year, one of my goals is to make our JPARS report as short as possible, if we can, because it is a lot of work, it's a lot of reporting. But really, when we think about the Grand Round series that we've produced, you're talking about 20 Grand Rounds targeting about 20 participants each. So not a lot of learners. And when you look at the feedback that you receive, you're lucky to get a quarter of those people to fill out the evaluation. So you're not talking about a lot of learners or really a lot of data. So I think it would be more helpful to be able to report something like that as an RSS, or if they want to come up with a different term for it, that would be great, I think.
And to your point, Kristen, in terms of the meaning that data would provide, I think collectively providing that data, it would likely have a lot more impact, and it may not be the same individual, but an oncologist in Texas, an oncologist in California, an oncologist in New Jersey is an oncologist. So I think that providing a collective report, it would definitely make a lot of sense.
And that's what we do internally. We provide a collective report that we then review with our internal stakeholders. That's what we also provide to our grant supporters. They're not going to look at one individual meeting to assess the outcome. So,
yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Pesha, before I move on to the next term, was there any additional comment that you wanted to add to that?
It sounds to me like I hope that the ACCME puts up a suggestion box button on their website to possibly accommodate some of these gray area definitions.
Or maybe someone from ACCME is watching.
Well, please send a comment or tweet away.
Scott, looks like you might have a question for us.
So we have two questions. So one is on RSS and one kind of goes back to disclosure. So I'm going to ask the RSS question first. So this came in over the free CME text line. All right. So how does the ACCME then define different target audiences? Is an audience of breast cancer specialists different than an audience of lung cancer specialists?
I'm not going to speak for the ACCME. That's always a danger, I guess, in saying, how does the ACCME define anything, or the ANCC? I think you're just going to have to go to the authority to find an absolute answer to that kind of question, unless if anybody else on the panel has a comment to say.
No, I don't think that they come out and define what the audience is. But again, with the RSS, they're using kind of broader terms, primarily and generally targets the same audience. They're talking about mostly professional staff at hospital systems. So for that one in particular, I feel like maybe you can make the argument either way. But I would like to make the argument that it's target audience and I'm getting the same target audience at every course.
Okay, so here's the other question that came in also on the free CME text line. So we're talking about over-disclosure. So here's the question. Does an over-disclosure dilute the real conflicts and confuse learners who already don't know what to do with all those relationships?
That is a great question. My initial response is, I don't know. There's something I've been thinking about, though, with this whole business disclosure and resolution, and I'm just going to muse about it for a couple of minutes, is that there's such a big emphasis on adult learners, and all of these people that we're providing the education for, they're adult learners, and they know what's relevant, and they're going into these activities because they have learning gaps, and they know what their gaps are. And in a way, what we're doing when we're engaging the presenters is maybe we're not treating them like adults. And we're saying, well, you need to disclose, and you need to disclose everything. And there ends up being all of this process that doesn't really sound like it's about adult learners. Maybe I'm just riffing, but I don't know that it actually dilutes the actual potential conflict. I can't really think of an example where that happens. I think, again, I'm going to turn to the adult learner. I think the adult learner is looking at those disclosures maybe for all of 3 seconds, and they're making their own conclusions. Well, let's see, this person got a grant from this pharmaceutical company, and it's on this topic, and now we're speaking about this topic in this activity. Well, maybe it's going to be biased. That's kind of where I hold with all of those disclosures. As a CME provider, I would rather provide too much than too little. And I think that if faculty are providing these disclosures, they're doing it for a reason. Is it to advertise they got a grant from the NIH? Well, maybe. Is it serving as like a mini CV for some of their professional activities? Well, maybe also. But I would err on the side of over disclosure than even plain old regular disclosure.
Great, thank you. Scott's disappeared, so no more questions. Moving on to Kristen, and this one is also in light of the year that we're experiencing. So moving on to activity formats, so other, hybrid, and then how do you report on these other formats? So over to you, Kristen.
Thanks. So one of the other ACCME activity formats that exists that I really paid no attention to until this year is something that they call other. So how that is defined by the ACCME is the other activity format is used for blended, new, or unique approaches that do not fall into one of the established activity types. Providers must identify these activities as other and include a brief description of the learning format in PARS, in the credit designation statement, and in any documentation given to the learners. The inclusion of the other activity format allows educators to deploy new technologies such as simulation, adaptive e-learning, virtual reality, and gamification. And some of those newer learning technologies we'll talk about a little bit later in the session, but where I kind of got stuck with the other activity this year is because, like many of you out there, you've had to pivot, which is probably everybody's least favorite word in the CME Dictionary this year. So you had to take what was going to be live in-person education and figure out how to provide that to your learners when live in-person education is not, it's just not possible. So what we've done is that we're switching to kind of a blended activity where we'll have a lot of pre-recorded information that the learners can view mixed in with live, real-time virtual activities. So when looking at other guidance from ACCME, one of the questions they answer is, how should virtual activities be reported in PARS? Well, here they say, determining the correct activity type for a virtual activity will depend on whether the learners participate in real time or can access the activity at any time. Activities where the learners participate in real time should be reported as Internet Live courses. Activities where content is accessible online at any time could be considered Internet activity enduring materials, but they don't explicitly cover blended activities. So I have a polling question for the audience to see if any of you have reported activities in PARS that would blend live online education with kind of enduring education, Or please answer C if you don't know at all what I'm talking about, and you are a lucky person. This is really what it looks like in my brain every time I think about this. Because I think, it's just kind of a new challenge that we've had to face in our organization, because typically our education falls into one of those predefined activities. It's either live, whether in person or online, or it's an enduring activity, or we do some journal-based CE. But this has been an interesting year where it's, I think it's not quite feasible for all providers. If you have a multi-day annual conference where you have 50 to 100 sessions planned, I don't think it's feasible to provide all of that in real time for your learners. And I don't know that you would even get the audience for it. So just be curious to hear either from the audience, if you have any examples you want to share, or from other members of the panel on what they think about this other format for something that really isn't necessarily what the other format was intended for.
Great. So we'll give the audience a chance to text some thoughts in. And in the meantime, we'll keep moving along because we have quite a few terms to cover. So the next category was different learning types, actually. And so, some of these come across as buzzwords within our industry. And, when we were doing our research around these, we took a look at how are these different learning styles defined outside of CME, and how are they incorporated in CME, actually. So the first one is spaced learning. So what does spaced learning mean? It's actually a learning method which takes highly condensed learning content, and it's repeated 3 times, but 3 times in different methods. And in between those 3 sessions, there are distractor activities to take the learner actually away from the education. So I'll give you an example. The faculty provides input of information, of clinical evidence. The break, jumping jacks in between, come back, and then it's learner recall of that information. So how much of that information did the learners recall? Break again, jumping jacks in between. And then it's how does that learner apply that information into their clinical practice? So input, break, recall, break, application. So learning events that are repeated over time are a lot more efficient and greater retention compared to single exposure of material in one full sweep. So I thought that was quite interesting to see how these types of sessions or this type of learning methodology can be used within CME. Now, of course, we're in a different environment now, but nonetheless, we still have virtual platforms like this. And a small group learning session is where this type of spaced learning might work nicely within our world. Kristen, any thoughts from you? I know that you had mentioned in your organization that you've also used spaced learning. Well, in a different way. This is one of the terms where there was different perspectives of it.
Right. So we called it spaced learning, maybe incorrectly, based on the definition that you just provided. But we have used what we've called spaced learning to define activities where there is an initial didactic lecture, whether live or enduring. And we follow that with some online interactive patient cases that are delivered a few months after the initial content was consumed by the learner. So we've just used that to really provide more learning reinforcement over time to ensure that they're retaining the knowledge, and then that they're able to apply the knowledge later on to really get at the behavior change that we were hoping for.
Yeah, I think that's interesting because there are, like I said at the start of this presentation, different perspectives or different ways of how some of these terms are being used. And then when it comes to learning styles, bringing it back to the adult learner that Pesha talked about earlier, we all have different learning styles, and there's different industries out there that use them differently as well. And so I thought it was interesting to see how we apply it, or how the NCCN has applied it, but how it can be applied elsewhere within in different educational programs. Moving on to branched learning. And of course, the audience, if you have any examples that you'd like to provide and how you've used some of these terms within your organization, that would also be very helpful and appreciative. So branching scenario is something that ties us back to some of our childhood of choose your own adventure type of books. So branching scenario is an interactive form of learning where the learner is making decisions as they go along, and the story is unfolding in different ways, in unpredictable ways as well. So they're making the learning becomes interactive, it becomes engaging, and it becomes fun, because you may try it one day and the outcome will be different, or getting to the outcome will be different. And you may try it a second day and the path that you take to get to the outcome might be a different path. So the educational activity ends up being designed through different routes of the content and depending on the input from the learner. Within our organization, we use this through case studies. So it's like a choose your own type of adventure. As they click on different responses, it brings them to a different interaction with the patient or a colleague. So it's an educational format that is actually tailored to the learner. It also becomes quite engaging and a gamified type of experience. Kristen, I think you also had some thoughts on branch learning.
Well, we don't do any branch learning per se. I think that one reason that we've kind of stayed away from it is we feel sometimes that learners can go down a suboptimal path and maybe get to the optimal path through trial and error. So we haven't really done branch learning, but we do have some patient management simulators that we've developed with an educational partner. And in those activities, the learner is provided with responsive mentoring and coaching at each of the different decision points. And a lot of times in oncology, there's really no right answer for a specific patient. There are multiple answers that could be considered correct. So we've just found that that's a more effective way to have kind of those nuanced conversations around new data or controversies or maybe adverse events with any particular treatment that you might just really need more conversation around instead of maybe a branched situation.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. So the branch learning that we provide in the form of cases also includes the mentoring throughout the activities, so that, like you said, it's not trial and error, and they are being guided by an expert throughout that patient case, but ultimately also selecting different options for that particular patient.
Okay.
Adaptive learning. I thought this one was interesting, and actually one that I learned about as I was preparing for this session. It's the delivery of custom learning experiences, and that it addresses unique needs of an individual through just-in-time feedback, pathways, different resources, and it's moving away from your one-size-fits-all type of experience. So depending on the learner's responses to the questions within the activity, an algorithm ends up being created on the back end that then provides a unique educational pathway. So as they get closer to completion, they get a good grasp of the concept, while others who require additional knowledge or additional content, they might have some additional questions come to them before they complete the activity. So it really ends up being a tailored experience to that specific learner. Kristen, I think your organization, you've included an adaptive learning module.
We are in the process of developing one now with one of our educational partners. And I think it's just a really interesting way to kind of provide that personalized education, the individualized education that everybody's looking to provide at this point, to really reinforce areas where the learners have deficits in their knowledge and avoid topics where they've already indicated or shown that they have a level of expertise. So really just defining those weak versus strong areas, so you can get to where you need more emphasis and where really not to waste time with redundant material. And the module that we're developing is also going to incorporate a confidence assessment with each question. So that kind of gets to another level of performance and really sees where the learner has an awareness of their own knowledge, or maybe they fail to recognize that they have a gap with some of the education. So we're looking forward to getting into this a little bit more and seeing, what kind of outcomes we can get from that.
Great, thank you. Dara, you're up. So I know
I'm here.
The next type of learning, which I'm sure a lot of us and those who are tuning in have heard about quite a bit. There was a session on this at the CBI event that took place just recently, is around microlearning. Now, unlike the other types of learning that we just went through, adaptive learning, branch learning, space learning, those actually all have clear, defined definitions associated to them. Microlearning, when I was researching that one, there are different interpretations to it in different industries. But there is some commonalities within all of those different types of definitions. So I'm going to hand it over to Dara and to Kristen to talk about microlearning.
Perfect, thank you. So like Aisha just mentioned, there's no real or official microlearning definition. When we're kind of exploring what this means from an educational standpoint, there is one key characteristic that's pretty consistent across the board, and that's the brevity included with microlearning and microtraining. So this could be really looking at small learning units or short-term learning activities. And this is where the microlearning or microtraining might deliver short bursts of content for learners to engage and study at their convenience. The content and kind of format can really vary. So you could look at some text-based programs to, interactive activities with different multimedia components, but really keeping that content short. And one thing that really stands out, and sometimes, I think a lot of us may think about microlearning, it's not taking that full, 1 hour program and dividing it into smaller sessions. While yes, that really cuts down on and makes, each segment short, it's really just creating modules of one larger program, which really doesn't fall within the microlearning, microtraining area. And so I think one challenge that exists is really the misunderstanding of microlearning, both on the provider and the supporter side. So from my perspective, I was really curious to dig a little deeper because it's a term that started popping up everywhere. And, I have my own perception and our understanding of what that might look like, but it looked a little different everywhere I would see it, perhaps in requests or even just in conversations with other people. And so, like Aisha mentioned, at CBI, there was a program. I'm always trying to gather, kind of best practices around this from my own perspective, and some takeaways there that I thought were helpful. And if you attended, you probably gleaned some of these insights as well. That for microlearning, it's really important to keep a limited focus for each segment. So really taking one learning objective for that one piece of content. And, instead of creating, including multiple learning objectives in this short, 10 to 15 minute piece of content. And then, looking, another kind of best practice that I had learned about was the spaced retrieval. So not cramming everything together, but creating several experiences over time and keeping that retrieval a little bit more separate. And then, utilizing multimedia or some interactive components, while obviously not required, like I mentioned, it really does vary with the format, but allows for that engagement with those short bursts of education. Another kind of best practice I've learned about as well is keeping the microlearning as part of, or microtraining as part of a larger initiative. So it's really supplementing and reinforcing whatever the learning objectives might be. So there's a larger project here, and then this is part of that education. And then assessing the right data. So I think when you're looking at something like microlearning and micro training, really identifying and planning what measures will demonstrate the impact of success for a program like this, and what those parameters are. So I thought it was really interesting to learn a little bit more, especially now since we're seeing, and it feel like it is becoming a buzzword, and hearing different perspectives, both from the supporter and the provider side, on what microlearning actually is. So, Kristen, did you have anything to add here?
Well, I think we're kind of in agreement, so that's good. And a supporter perspective, but just to reemphasize what you already said, having the microlearning be focused on that one learning objective. Because if you take a 45-minute presentation and chop it up, that was developed to be a 45-minute presentation. It's not going to have the same focus if you start from the beginning saying this is going to be focused on this learning objective and should be no longer than 15 minutes long. I think you're going to get a really different presentation from the faculty than if you just after the fact try to chop it up. So we are in agreement. That's what it should be.
Excellent.
Great.
I agree with anybody today.
So Dara, back to you as well, to discuss educational effectiveness. And I think a lot of the supporters tuning in would love to hear your perspective on what defines educational effectiveness on some of the newer platforms that you've been seeing.
Sure, thank you. So I can't really say that I have a specific definition here. I think what makes this topic really interesting is that the word effectiveness and even the measures used to determine effectiveness are so varied. So many different responses will exist and come back with what makes an effective program. And so actually, before kind of launching into a bit of discussion, I'd love to, Scott, pull up the open chat question, which really opens it up to the audience to share, how do you measure effectiveness? And so I'll just give it some time here. And we didn't create this as a poll. We really wanted to get some insight into and probably showcase how varied this is in a general sense. So if you could share your thoughts here, and we should be able to see them, I think, on the screen once you start sharing.
So for those of you who are using the app, or you can just type in what your response is, and I guess just try to keep it short and just kind of in a just like this.
Yes, perfect. So closing the professional gap, engagement of learners. These are two great responses here. The learner was able to learn and apply into practice. Evaluation initially and follow-up 3, 6, 9 months later. When a change in practice is made. So we're seeing some trends here, and I think this is to be expected, but of course it looks a little different. And I think, if we look at a general definition of effectiveness, it's really looking at the degree to which something is successful in producing a desired result, right? So identifying what that success is, and kind of thinking about this topic, there's a few areas that I thought shape and really impact measuring effectiveness, and which also then creates the variety in identifying what does it mean to be effective. So you're looking at the activity format, right? So we have all these different types of activity formats, and the differences even within those formats, an effective measure might look different across the board. There's also considerations to look at with the learner reporting back by way of survey or feedback. So that can also create variety as well. And then there's the supporter expectations for measurement. And obviously it can create some differences in variety in that regard as well. So for example, if we take a look at total learners as, say, a measure of effectiveness, there's a couple of things. It seems pretty simple, right? So total number of learners, we'll use that to measure success. If we're looking at that as the criteria, the definition might vary across the board. So a completer might be defined as a learner who completes 100% of the program or activity, but one could argue that, you know, completing 75% of the given activity may still have strong effectiveness because that learner is engaging and consuming the content that's most relevant for them and important for them. So in a sense, that could be effective as well. So even within this tiny little scope, there's some variety in there as well. And, you know, of course, you just kind of span this across different activity types, different terms, things of that nature. It can get a bit challenging. So like Aisha, sorry about that, mentioned, what was really interesting for me personally is trying to look at this from a perspective of all of these new learning formats that are being introduced in the CME space. So for example, I took podcasts because I feel like microlearning, that is something that is starting to evolve and be more present in the educational space across the board. And so with that, it's really hard for me to look at that and say, okay, well, what makes that an effective program? And that's really hard to identify because some, you know, there's challenges within that. And so you're trying to understand if the capabilities exist to obtain the data to measure the effectiveness. There's the varying supporter expectations within, you know, a newer learning format, say like a podcast. And then there's also the varying provider capabilities as to what can be, you know, measured and presented as outcomes. So, you know, I can look at a podcast and say, well, you know, these few things would seem like an effective program to me, whereas someone else might look at it and say, actually, this is what's effective. And so there's no defined measure there. And quite frankly, it's a bit of a challenge to even acquire some information to measure effectiveness traditionally, say with a podcast, just for the mere because of how it's accessed and or consumed. So, you know, reaching out to folks who are creating these educational programs via podcast, even they too are looking at different things, such as the percentage of participants who listen from start to end, say, or the number of participants who complete the program and then take that next step to for a test to receive credit, or it's looking at the number of downloads, or it's looking at listener retention. So how many are participating in more than one series within that overall program? Or is it the depth of participation and engagement? So how much time are they spending in that activity? So, well, I won't sit here and say this is what the definition is. It just kind of raises the curiosity to work to identify that. And I think that's what's interesting, I think, in this time where there's a lot of evolving, you know, and especially with the focus on non-live programming and how else learners consume their education, what that looks like from a kind of measurement standpoint and effectiveness, I think will continue to evolve just as the educational formats will as well.
Definitely. And I also think that supporters' expectations change and evolve as well. And then how that's communicated internally and the internal stakeholders. I mean, I'm sure, Dara, you also have some of your internal stakeholders that you have to communicate the effectiveness of the CME activities that you've supported and what's most relevant to them. And so it's something that is continuously evolving, and being on the provider side, it's understanding what those needs are. With just 5 minutes left to the session, gosh, that went really, really quickly. Wow. We have 2 terms left. So Dara, back to you in regards to confidence assessment. And you and I are both on this one, so we'll try and keep it as efficient as possible.
Sure, certainly. So I think with confidence assessment, we're really looking at, if we're going to look at a definition, it's an assessment during the actual education that identifies whether a learner is really sure of the answer or to what degree are they guessing. So Typically, it's adding a layer to questions as I'm sure, I think, I'm guessing, just to get a sense of that level of confidence. And these are all self-reported, right, by the certainty of the learner engaging the activity. And so a few examples, an overconfident learner may not be as open to testing, referrals, or consultations with peers because they feel very confident in their knowledge. Whereas an underconfident learner may process a plethora of information or continue on with additional patient testing, whatever it might be, which could be seen as potentially wasting time if there's a certain issue with a patient as well. So, in looking at competence assessment, I really look at it in relation to competence and knowledge. It's more of a challenge to have a high confidence learner with a lower competence, right? Because you're really sure of yourself, but you're wrong or not right. And then, really, obviously, the ideal is to have high confidence with high competence associated with it. So, I was doing some research into kind of competence assessments outside of the industry, just in different areas, and some studies that were done identifying that answering questions with just confidence level without any sort of knowledge questions or comprehension or competence really provides a skewed look at true confidence levels. So it's not as accurate as of a depiction because you're just answering how confident you are about certain information. But when evaluated together, looking at confidence and competence, right, the knowledge associated with it together in a question or group of questions, you have a better, more accurate depiction of how confident someone is, because they're then taking that next step to answer that specific knowledge question. So when measured alone, confidence could be seen as inflated, if not associated with that competence or knowledge questions, which is quite interesting. So do you have anything here to add, Aisha?
No, I think you covered it nicely. I think, I've seen it incorporated within the educational activity itself, or I've seen it being sent to the learner right after they've completed the activity. But to your point, I think that might provide a skewed answer because they've already answered anyway. So I think it's really important to incorporate within the activity. I want to make sure we cover the last term, and there's only 2 minutes left. So Dara and Pesha. Dara, I'll start with you, and this is change in performance.
Sure. So in the interest of time, and I want to allow Pesha some time to chat here too. So when we're looking at change in performance, we're really looking at referring to measured changes in a learner's behavior overall, right? So it's did the degree to which a participant or a learner do what the CME activity intended them to do and be able to do in their practice. So this provides obviously some rich information. I think a couple of things I had given thought to here with performance is the source of the data for the measurement. So being either objective or subjective. Objective is really observing the performance in that patient care setting with patient charts, administrative databases, et cetera. And then more so what I'm more familiar with is the subjective kind of self-reporting of performance in follow-up to whatever that activity might have been. And so obviously that's subjective. They're answering self-reporting on their change in behavior. And so, the limits of objective measures would include kind of resource intensive, lack of standardization, and problem with translating measures to computer language, and it may distinguish the learner's data in the context of large practice groups. So I think to the degree that it provides information and understanding that level of change and aligned with a specific learning objective post CME activity. Pesha, your thoughts here?
Yeah, I'm just going to wrap it up with the last few definitions that we were talking about. And I would think that when you're talking about educational effectiveness, you're talking about the learner's approach to the activity. And it's more like a measure of this eagerness to learn And when you're talking about confidence, I'm going to refer to Moore's levels. Confidence is the ability to know how, but when you're talking about your change in performance, that's where you're getting into the level of shows how. I do want to point out that the ACCME has a FAQ on its website specifically saying that improvements in knowledge and plans to change performance would not meet the expectation of this criterion of 36 of changing performance. So that wraps it up for me.
Great, thank you. Scott?
All right. Well, great, everyone. Thank you so much for this for this really interesting talk. And I think you guys covered a lot of ground, and you also learned just how quickly 1 hour goes. So for those folks who are watching this either live or the archive version, please complete our very, very brief survey at the bottom of the live tab. The idea for this session actually came from one of our surveys in the spring. So we do listen to these surveys, and we do plan some of the sessions based upon your recommendations. Our next session is beginning right now. So if you're watching this live and you want to tune in for the 2 p.m. Eastern session, you'll learn all about program management in CME. So with that, I'd like to thank Aisha, Pesha, Dara, and Kristen for their time, and we will see everyone soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.